the government has a long-term objective as an average of generating a surplus of 2% of GDP. Now remember, I showed you the American data over the last century. Their average was a deficit of 2.5%. So here are the Swedes saying they're trying to achieve a 2% surplus over the cycle. And this is, again, this is an argument about saving for a rainy day effectively. The surplus will make it possible to reduce public debt so that future challenges, when they occur, can be accepted without leading to problems in government finances. So this is the mindset that a lot of economists have. And what actually happened? That's what they were trying to achieve in 1998. What actually happened? Well, government debt did fall for a while. So this is looking at government debt as a percentage of GDP. So it started at 65% in 2000. It fell to 50% in 2006. But then after the financial crisis went down to 35%. So they appear to be achieving what they were aiming for. But then from 2012 on, it rose once more. So they weren't particularly successful. They were reasonably successful in trying to reduce the level. But when you look what they were trying to achieve as well, they said they were after a 2% surplus. But in fact, which would have meant, if you look at the change in government debt every year, it should have been minus 2% when you divide by GDP. In fact, it was plus 0.5%. Looking at the debt-to-GDP change, it only fell in absolute terms between early in 2000 and then between 2006 and 2008. So the level of debt was rising. Why do you think the actual ratio fell? GDP rose faster than government debt rose. Okay, so you've got you're always looking at a ratio, and people talk about a debt to GDP. They've got a ratio at the level of government debt divided by the GDP. They're trying to they try to reduce the top one. That's the focus. They tend to ignore GDP. In this particular case, GDP, which is the denominator, rose faster than government debt, which is the numerator, so the ratio fell. So it wasn't because they cut government spending, it's because GDP grew more rapidly than government debt was, so the ratio fell for that reason for most of the time. So why did it fail to achieve it? Well, this is what was happening with private debt at the same time. So you see notice the level of private debt here, starts at 140%, goes along at 170 for a while, rises to 250% of GDP. Now that's 6 times the level of government debt. Okay? But this is actually being ignored in the thinking that I showed you earlier from the central bank. They were obsessed about the overwhelming and dangerous level of government debt, paid no attention at all to the level of private debt. So it's 5 times. This is looking now at the ratio. There's the blue line is the one the government was obsessing about, reducing the level of government debt. The red line is one they didn't even discuss, which is the level of private debt. And this is common. If you look at what's happening in terms of the debate in Parliament right now in England, it's all about reducing government debt. Any idea what the level of government debt is, roughly? It's about 100% of GDP. What do you reckon private debt is? Any ideas? About 170%. Okay. So again, why the focus upon government debt? Why ignore private debt? Now, when you look at the change in debt, you find that the change in private debt was many times larger than government debt. For a start, government debt's smaller. Okay? So if you look at the change in one versus the change in the other, and private debt's 5 times as big as government debt, it's more likely to have a larger change as well. But in fact, the changes were larger still. And what you find is there's a negative correlation between the two. When one rises, the other tends to fall. So this is looking at Swedish debt to GDP ratios, and you see that the blue line is the government debt level. The red line is the change in the blue line's the change in the government debt level. The red's the change in the private. They are fairly strongly negatively correlated. When there's a huge increase in private debt, government debt falls. When private debt starts to fall, government debt rises. So they tend to work in opposite directions. But this has been, again, there's no discussion of this in the Swedish attempt to understand what happened with their economy. Now, what you also find, this is looking at Swedish data, and I'll find a much stronger example for you with English and with American data. There's unemployment tends to fall and private debt's rising. In that particular case, the correlation's minus 0.45. The unemployment data there's not seasonally adjusted, which is why it's so spiky. If I had seasonally adjusted data, the correlation would most likely be higher. So what you have is a relationship. Falling private debt leads to rising unemployment. Rising private debt leads to falling unemployment. What about with government debt? Well, you find, and this might be where some of the thinking comes from about the need for sound finance, the correlation is positive. In other words, if you have rising government debt, you have rising unemployment. Falling government debt, you have falling unemployment. You know the old classic cliche you've got from your stats lecturers all the time, that correlation doesn't imply causation. Okay? What's the logic behind that argument? This is correlated. So you might, yeah.
There's high unemployment and there's more spending on welfare.
So which direction would you say the causation is in? Unemployment to government spending or government spending to unemployment?
Unemployment causes higher.
Unemployment causes government spending. So what you've got is a potential causal relationship. The direction could be from unemployment to government spending or government spending to unemployment. So the correlation doesn't let you decide that. But there's one other thing about the correlation is not causation argument that matters, because you might get correlation between two things, but they're actually both correlated to something else, which is actually the causal factor. Okay, so you're looking at this, you might say, well, unemployment causes government spending, but what causes unemployment? Okay. Now, looking at that piece of data alone, you're just saying maybe government spending causes unemployment. So you need a more complete picture than you've got out of just that particular argument.